On this Saturday night, happy homecoming. More emotional reunions as another round of Israelis and Palestinians are released as part of the Gaza ceasefire. Why Israel is accusing Hamas of failing to deliver on its side of the deal. Leading the Liberals, candidate Mark Carney snags more major cabinet endorsements, but will they translate into votes? Remembering Bill Wilson, the life and legacy of the Indigenous leader who spent decades fighting for change. Plus, a crash course in tobogganing. Canada's longest-running engineering competition slides into Montreal.
Global National. Reporting tonight, Jeff Semple.
An emotional homecoming in Israel. 4 women held hostage by Hamas in Gaza for 15 months, finally reunited with family and friends. And similar scenes on the other side. Palestinians celebrating the release of 200 prisoners from Israeli jails. The second exchange is part of the Gaza ceasefire deal that went into effect last Sunday. Good evening and thank you for joining us. A total of 7 Israelis and nearly 300 Palestinians have now been released over this past week. Hopeful signs that the ceasefire deal is progressing as planned toward a permanent end to the war and a lasting peace in the region. But along with those celebrations, there were also accusations that Hamas is failing to abide by the terms of the deal. Sean O'Shea explains in our top story tonight.
The faces of the families, watching an end to their personal nightmares. 4 Israeli hostages, all female soldiers, released in the second prisoner exchange in the ceasefire agreement. This one highly orchestrated by Hamas and criticized by Israel's military as a cynical ceremony. The women were brought onto a podium in Gaza City for all to see, their hands held high.
Liri Elbag, age 19. Naama Levi, age 20. Karina Arayev, age 20. Daniela Gilboa, age 20.
This prisoner release included a show of support for Hamas. Today is total victory, this woman said, showering Hamas militants with confetti. The 4 Israelis were turned over to the International Red Cross, transported to an Israeli army location in Gaza, where they were greeted by fellow soldiers and then driven into Israel in a blue van. In exchange, Israel released 200 Palestinians held in Israeli jails. The majority arrived in Red Cross buses in the West Bank to a hero's welcome. According to Hamas, those released included convicted militants serving life sentences for their involvement in attacks that killed dozens of people. About 70 were sent by bus to Egypt and 16 were returned to Gaza. The freed Israeli soldiers left southern Israel in an army helicopter and flown to a hospital in central Israel, where family members watched with excitement as the 4 arrived 477 days after they were captured. The moments they'd been waiting for.
Their medical condition is stable, and we are here to provide them with the necessary care and emotional support.
These hostages were among a group of soldiers who warned about a possible Hamas attack before October 7th, having observed growing numbers of protesters at the border fence. Those warnings were ignored. Israel said Hamas was obligated to release a civilian hostage under the deal, but Arbel Yahud wasn't among those freed. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Palestinians will not be allowed to return to northern Gaza until she's released.
This is what we're waiting for, and now we will wait for the release of 90 more hostages who must get this chance as well, come back to their lives.
Watching today's return from Tel Aviv, tears of joy in the crowd, and hope that 3 more hostages will be released a week from now and every 7 days if the ceasefire agreement holds. Sean O'Shea, Global News, Toronto.
After a slowdown of deliveries on Friday, hundreds of truckloads of aid poured into Gaza today as part of that ceasefire deal. More than 4,200 aid trucks have now entered the Palestinian enclave since that agreement was reached last weekend. The deal requires at least 600 aid trucks be allowed into Gaza each day. Only 329 trucks arrived on Friday. The UN did not explain the one-day drop, except to say that they are working as quickly as possible. And turning to Israel's other ceasefire deal on its northern border, the Israeli government now says it will not withdraw its forces from Lebanon by Sunday's deadline, in violation of its agreement that ended months of fighting with Hezbollah. Israeli forces have instead been seen setting up roadblocks across border towns and roads in southern Lebanon today. That deal, which went into effect in late November, gave both sides 60 days to remove their forces and allow the Lebanese army to secure the area. But Israel claims Hezbollah and Lebanon haven't met their obligations. Lebanon accuses Israeli forces of preventing its military from taking control. The U.S. is reportedly hitting pause on all foreign aid, except for food and military funding for Israel and Egypt. That's according to a leaked internal memo sent to staff at the State Department. It says aid funding is being frozen for 90 days pending a review, as consistent with President Trump's agenda. The move threatens billions of dollars of funding from the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development for global programs including health, education, and security. And it also appears to include suspending critical military assistance for Ukraine. The United States provides more foreign aid than any other country, spending the equivalent of around $100 billion Canadian in 2023. President Trump has threatened to slap 25% tariffs on Canadian goods entering the U.S. starting next weekend. The federal government is preparing for possible retaliation, and provincial and territorial governments also have a stake in what could become a full-blown trade war. Mercedes Stevenson is looking at what's being done to deal with Washington and joins me now from Ottawa. Mercedes.
Jeff, as the clock ticks closer to Donald Trump's latest tariff deadline, there are quiet but intense efforts underway in Washington, D.C. to try and keep critical trade flowing. Those efforts are not only being undertaken by the federal government, but also by some provinces. Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta all maintain permanent representatives in the American capital to advocate for their provincial interests. And with what some have said is a gap in federal leadership, well, the provincial reps have never been busier. This week on the West Block, we sit down with David Patterson. He's Ontario's representative in Washington, and we'll find out what's going on behind the scenes, where he's highlighting how dependent the USA is on many Canadian products. That includes critical minerals from Ontario that are used in U.S. national security applications.
Nickel is something that comes from Ontario. It's high grade, and it's not replaceable from other places in the world for military purposes, for ammunition, for batteries, all kinds of things. And we're talking about a very high volume. There is no nickel in the United States.
Patterson also gives us a feel for how the new administration and key Republicans are reacting. Do they share the bombastic views in Trump's speeches, or are things a little friendlier than you might expect?
I have not had a bad meeting or a bad word from a Republican in the last year. I mean, generally, people love Canada. We're running ads down here that are warmly responded to from Ontario, reminding them of our how important we are as allies and how we've stood together.
And you can watch more of Mercedes' conversation with David Patterson tomorrow morning on the West Block. That's right here on Global. Mark Carney, one of the contenders to replace Justin Trudeau as Liberal Party leader, got 3 more high-profile endorsements today. Carney held a campaign-style event in Toronto where he was endorsed by Canada's Housing Minister, Nate Erskine-Smith. He joins Defence Minister Bill Blair and Transport Minister Anita Anand, also announcing today that they're backing Carney. That brings to 15 the number of cabinet ministers who now support the former Bank of Canada governor. Carney's main rival, Chrystia Freeland, has been endorsed by 5 cabinet ministers. One of Canada's most prominent defenders of Indigenous rights has died. Bill Wilson, a hereditary chief and father of former Liberal cabinet minister Jody Wilson-Raybould, is being remembered for his fight to enshrine Indigenous title to land and treaty rights in the Constitution. Richard Zussman looks back at Wilson's life and legacy.
It was here, around this table, in his Campbell River home on Vancouver Island, where Bill Wilson spent much of his final years, a son of a fisherman who caught more than just salmon.
People here at this table who are more concerned with protecting the power they have.
He caught the attention of a country.
I could have had anything in the white world that I wanted, and I never saw it to be any kind of a challenge. I mean, I was a good athlete, a good scholar, a good citizen. Could probably have been the prime minister, but I left that to others.
an advocate for Indigenous rights, in 1973 becoming the second Indigenous person to graduate from UBC's law school, crediting his mom for getting him that degree.
I said, I'm thinking of quitting because I wasn't doing very well. And she said, you're not quitting, you're going to go to law school. Stop this bullshit and get on with the work you need to do. She says, you have been given gifts that you have to use to help our people.
And it was around this table where he made his most prominent mark, squaring off against then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, successfully negotiating an amendment to Canada's Constitution to enshrine Indigenous title to traditional lands as well as equality of Indigenous women. Sharing these thoughts in a wide-ranging interview in 2023 with Global National reporter Neethu Garcha.
And that put me at the table with Trudeau and the others. And that, I think, is a large part of history, not just mine, but history generally.
And setting up this famous exchange.
I have 2 children in Vancouver Island, both of whom want to be the Prime Minister. both of whom, Mr. Prime Minister, are women.
Wilson survived by those 2 daughters, Corey and Jody. Jody, Canada's first ever Indigenous Attorney General. Our dad was a compelling orator, fierce and precise, funny and charming. He always felt we could and must do better, and he demanded that we do so. Wilson Raybould sharing this image as well. The sunset on her father's final day, a life and legacy that continues to burn bright. Richard Zussman, Global News, Victoria.
Abandoning the climate accord. Coming up, the impact of Donald Trump's decision to bail on the global deal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Plus, slaying the competition. Montreal plays host to a toboggan race with a twist. The cleanup is underway in Ireland and Scotland after a powerful storm pummeled parts of the United Kingdom. On Friday, millions of people were without power, and one person in Ireland died when a tree fell on his car. Storm Éowyn lashed the region with fierce winds reaching 183 kilometers an hour, breaking a record set way back in 1945. Scientists warn extreme weather is getting more intense and frequent as a result of climate change. But President Trump is moving forward with his plans to dismantle U.S. climate policy and pledges. Trump is rolling back everything from electric vehicle rebates to renewable energy programs. And as Redmond Shannon reports, he's also pulling the U.S. once again out of the world's most important climate accord.
It is almost 8 years since Donald Trump first announced his policy on the Paris Climate Accord.
The United States will withdraw.
But it took until the very end of his first term for that to be enacted, a move quickly reversed by Joe Biden, a U.S. U-turn undone on Monday.
But I'm immediately withdrawing from the unfair, one-sided Paris Climate Accord ripoff.
It will still take 1 year for the U.S. to leave, again joining Iran, Libya and Yemen as the only countries outside the pact.
Make Argentina great again.
Argentina's president and Trump ally Javier Milei has suggested he may pull out of the Paris Accord process too.
I think it's grim days ahead for multilateralism.
Trump has also repealed Joe Biden's ban on oil drilling in parts of Alaska. One estimate says by 2030, U.S. annual emissions will be 20% higher than they would have been under a Kamala Harris administration. Although under Biden, U.S. fossil fuel production surged to record levels after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At the UN's annual climate summit last year, the US was among nations that agreed a larger fund to support climate action in poorer countries, something Trump can't escape entirely.
Because the United States is not leaving the World Bank, it will continue, whether it likes to or not, to be financing climate action, because that is what the management of those multilateral development banks are doing.
Trump's threat of new trade tariffs could also impact climate action, according to this expert.
Tariffs are really the issue that can make or break the diffusion of green technologies across the globe.
Trump's impending tariff decision that could be felt far beyond North America. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Still ahead, why a Canadian veteran is dropping out of a class action lawsuit alleging racial discrimination. A Canadian veteran has removed himself from a class action lawsuit alleging racial discrimination in the military. Wallace Fowler claims he faced derogatory slurs and suffered post-traumatic stress because of racist remarks from colleagues. Heidi Petracek reports on why he's decided to fight this battle alone.
This is like an early response that you got.
Back in 2005 when I just after I got out the military.
Military veteran Wallace Fowler has spent 2 decades fighting for recognition of the racial discrimination he endured while in the Canadian Armed Forces, when derogatory racial slurs were hurled at him and his family on base.
It's a vicious circle that keeps going around, right? You're not designed to beat the system.
He was one of the 3 lead plaintiffs in a class action alleging racism in the military, but was removed after he filed his own lawsuit instead. The class action is now settled, awarding a total of $150 million for thousands of Canadian Forces members who experienced racism during their service, dating as far back as 1985. But Fowler won't see a cent of that.
It wasn't about the money. I made that perfectly clear. And if that was the case, I would have taken this money and just shut up.
He refused to sign off on the deal because he says it omitted his allegation military officials colluded to deny the discrimination he experienced.
Lawyers for the class action say Fowler is within his rights to opt out, and other class members can do the same. The federal government says it believes the final agreement was negotiated in good faith and includes a letter of apology from the Chief of the Defense Staff.
They're a last resort for military members and veterans who have been harmed by the institution.
This expert on discrimination in the military acknowledges class actions aren't perfect, but do expose systemic problems.
Racism is not isolated to the military. And so really what we need to do is support the people within the organization who are doing anti-racism work.
They're trying to dismiss my case in court.
In the meantime, Fowler isn't giving up. According to court documents, the federal crown has denied the claims in his independent lawsuit and has made a motion to strike it. Heidi Petracek, Global News, Bible Hill, Nova Scotia.
Near Montreal today, a competition of a different sort. Hundreds of engineering students from universities across the country put their minds and bodies to the test. They set out to build the best toboggan made of concrete. But as Dan Spector shows us, it was all downhill from there.
When you think of a toboggan, you probably don't think of a surfboard-themed hunk of aluminum and concrete, but this is what you'll see at the Great Northern Concrete Toboggan Race, a Canadian tradition unlike any other.
We were flying down our first run.
The GNCTR started in 1974. This year's edition took over a hill in Terrebonne, near Montreal. Hundreds of Canadian engineering students from universities across the country gather every year to race toboggans they carefully crafted for months in order to meet the event's unique criteria.
It has to fit 5 people in the toboggan. It has to have a metal roll cage superstructure, a braking and a steering system, and a completely concrete running surface.
At the heart of the competition are science and innovation.
It's a big steel welded frame that we do 3D modeling to make everything.
We do a layup with epoxy and we let that cure.
But spirit and style points are what makes it truly special. Everyone has a theme and they slide right into it.
It's a yellow submarine.
We modeled our toboggan like a metro to represent Montreal.
The University of Manitoba's is all about Greek mythology.
Everything we did is a lot of like clouds, lightning bolts.
Everyone cheers for their rivals, dances in between runs.
The vibes are amazing. The people are so nice.
It's a good thing the energy is so positive because on this day, there was a lot of disappointment. After months of painstaking work, most of the teams did not make it down the hill. Many barely made it past the starting line.
The hill beat us.
Though only some left with bragging rights, all left with new friends, lessons learned, and a sparkling new line to add to their resumes.
We have a lot of hires that end up happening through this competition.
Many of the schools are already scheming up their designs for next year's Great Northern Toboggan Race. It will be hosted by Western in London, Ontario. Dan Spector, Global News, Terrebonne, Quebec.
A for effort. That is Global National for this Saturday. I'm Jeff Semple. Thanks for watching. Have a great night.